Rorke's Drift, Natal. The 22nd of January, 1879. Fewer than 150 British soldiers held a mission station built for a hospital and a store. Beyond the makeshift walls, an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 Zulu warriors advanced in disciplined formation. The mathematics of the moment favored only one side, and it was not the side behind the mealie bag barricade. By dawn, the defenders still held the station. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for a single night's fighting, more than for any other action in British military history, before or since. But the real story of the Martini Henry is not the defense of one outpost. It is the story of a rifle assembled from other men's rejected ideas, adopted by a committee that trusted no single inventor, and carried by an empire that used it to write the final chapter of muzzle-loading warfare in blood. Every week we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins not in Britain, but in Switzerland and Scotland. Two men who never worked in the same room. Friedrich von Martini was born in 1833 in Frauenfeld in the Swiss canton of Thurgau, a region of small workshops and precision trades far from any center of firearms manufacturing. His family had Hungarian roots. His father worked in engineering circles connected to the machine trade, not the gun trade. Martini himself trained not as a gunsmith but as a mechanical engineer, working for years on industrial machinery and locomotive components before he ever touched a rifle action. This mattered. He did not think like a gunsmith. He thought like a machinist solving a mechanical problem. And the problem in front of him by the 1860s was the falling block breech action patented by the American Henry Peabody. The Peabody action was sound but clumsy. A lever-operated block that dropped to expose the chamber, cocked by a separate external hammer. Martini looked at it the way an engineer looks at a machine with one too many moving parts. He redesigned the internal mechanism so the falling block itself cocked an internal striker automatically on opening, removing the external hammer entirely. Records suggest he filed his refined patent in 1868, working largely alone, financed modestly through his own engineering contracts rather than any outside investor. Alexander Henry was a different kind of craftsman altogether. Born in 1828 in Duns, in the Scottish borders, he apprenticed as a gunmaker in Edinburgh, at a time when Scotland's target shooting culture, long-range rifle matches at Wimbledon and beyond, demanded barrels of exceptional accuracy. Henry's trade was rifling, cutting the internal spiral grooves, rifling the helical grooves inside a barrel that spin a bullet in flight, stabilizing it the way a thrown football spirals for a truer path, into barrel steel with a precision that won him medals at competitive shooting matches through the 1860s. Henry's rifling system used a distinctive 7-groove polygonal profile, shallower and more durable under sustained firing than the deep grooves common on military barrels of the period. By one account, his barrels were already being tested informally by British ordnance officials before any formal trial was announced. Martini and Henry never founded a company together. They never met as business partners in the way Colt met his financiers or Winchester met Oliver Winchester's tailoring capital. Instead, both men submitted separate proposals into the same arena, a War Office trials process searching for a breech-loading rifle to replace the aging Snyder-Enfield conversion. This is where the market gap must be understood in two parts. Part A. Before 1869, the British Army's Snyder-Enfield was itself only a stopgap. A muzzle-loading Enfield pattern rifle hastily converted to breech-loading by inserting a hinged block, adopted in 1866 because a full ground-up breech loader could not be agreed upon in time. It was slow to reload compared to emerging European designs. Its conversion action was not built for the mechanism from first principles, and colonial commanders, facing increasingly well-armed opposition from the Zulu kingdom to the Afghan frontier, reported it inadequate against modern rifled weapons, reaching the same battlefields through European arms dealers. Part B. The War Office Small Arms Committee, chaired through multiple trial rounds at the Woolwich testing grounds, recognized the gap not through any single inventor's vision, but through elimination. Dozens of designs were tested and rejected across the 1860s. The committee's own trial records, by one account, note that no single submitted rifle satisfied every requirement, until officials proposed combining two winning elements from two separate, unconnected submissions. Martini's action mated to Henry's barrel. 4 hyper-specific details anchor this origin. Martini's 1868 patent filing for the improved falling block action. Henry's 7-groove rifling profile perfected through the 1860s Wimbledon shooting seasons. The Woolwich trials process that ran across multiple years before a final combined design was approved in 1871. And the War Office's decision to name the composite rifle after both men, Martini-Henry, rather than crediting a single inventor, an almost unprecedented act of institutional even-handedness in British ordnance history. Neither man would control what happened next. That belonged to the government arsenal at Enfield Lock. The rifle that emerged from Enfield Lock in 1871 was, in physical terms, a single-shot, breech-loading rifle firing a rolled brass cartridge, chambered first in .450 caliber, later standardized as the A. 577 450ths, a bottlenecked round. Pairing a wide base with a narrower bullet diameter for better feeding and ballistic efficiency. Operation was simple enough for a recruit to learn in an afternoon, yet mechanically distinct from anything the British Army had issued before. A lever beneath the trigger guard worked forward and down, dropped the breech block, a solid steel plug sealing the rear of the barrel, exposing the chamber. This same motion, thanks to Martini's refinement, cocked an internal striker automatically. No external hammer, no separate cocking action. The soldier loaded a fresh cartridge, closed the lever, and fired, a cycle that trained troops could repeat 10 to 12 times a minute under field conditions, roughly triple the rate of the muzzle-loading rifles it replaced. Price point sat outside ordinary commercial comparison, since the rifle was never sold retail in the way a Colt or Winchester was marketed to individual buyers. Instead, government procurement cost is the relevant figure. By one account, unit production cost at Enfield ran to roughly £2 per rifle in the early 1870s, modest against the multi-year institutional investment required to retool government arsenals for the new action. But the true expenditure was never about a single unit price. It was about equipping an army of hundreds of thousands across an empire that spanned every climate on Earth. Go-to market for a state-owned weapon meant something entirely different from commercial sales. There was no dealer network, no export agent in Hamburg, no presentation piece for a foreign head of state. Adoption moved through a single channel. Official War Office patent approval followed by phased issue. First to regular infantry battalions, then to colonial garrison troops, then to volunteer and militia units across the empire, and eventually, by the late 1870s, to select colonial police forces in India and southern Africa. The institutional moat in place of a patent moat was total and immediate. Once the War Office designated the Martini-Henry the standard service rifle, no competing design could enter British military service without displacing an existing, fully funded, empire-wide logistics and ammunition supply chain, an obstacle no private manufacturer's patent could ever replicate. The rifle was not protected by law. It was protected by the sheer institutional weight of having already been chosen. The pattern was not paperwork. It was the entire apparatus of imperial military logistics. Early deployment was not measured in named commercial clients, but in named formations and theaters. The regular infantry of the British Army, garrison battalions in India under the Bengal, Madras, and Bombay commands, colonial forces in the Cape Colony and Natal, volunteer rifle corps raised across Britain itself for home defense, and, from 1877 onward, mounted infantry and native levies in the escalating Ninth Cape Frontier War against the Xhosa. Production scaled with the urgency of empire. RSAF Enfield alone produced tens of thousands of rifles annually through the mid-1870s, with additional manufacturing capacity licensed to the Birmingham Small Arms Company and the London Small Arms Company to meet demand. The government arsenal could not fill alone. By one estimate, well over 500,000 Martini-Henry rifles had been manufactured across all three facilities before production wound down in the following decade. By the mid-1870s, the Martini-Henry was standard issue across a British army, stretched over more territory than any military force in history had ever attempted to hold at once. Naming the buyers means naming the theatres. The Northern and Southern armies of the Ashanti Campaign in West Africa in 1873 and 1874, the garrison of Gibraltar, the mounted police of the Cape Colony, the Volunteer Rifle Corps of Ontario and the Canadian Militia, the Natal Native Contingent, armed, controversially, and only partially, alongside regular imperial regiments. And from 1878, the entire British field force assembled for a new war on the Afghan frontier. Production milestones through the decade tell their own story. RSAF Enfield's workforce grew to accommodate sustained government contracts, with output measured in the tens of thousands of rifles per year across Enfield, Birmingham Small Arms, and London Small Arms combined. Export in the conventional commercial sense barely existed. The rifle was not sold abroad as a product line, but its presence multiplied wherever a British regiment was posted, from Halifax to Hong Kong. Then came January 1879. The moment everything changed. Lord Chelmsford's invasion force crossed into Zulu territory on the 11th of January, 1879, without a formal declaration of war in the European sense, an ultimatum delivered to King Cetshwayo, rejected, and a colonial invasion launched within weeks. No single War Department order retooled a factory floor here, as it might for Colt in 1917. Instead, the entire logistics of empire, ammunition trains, garrison reinforcement, colonial requisition, converged on a single frontier, what the rifle had been carrying and what it was now asked to prove. The Martini-Henry had already served in smaller colonial actions. It had never been tested against a disciplined, numerically overwhelming force fighting on its own terrain, with its own logistics and its own commanders who understood modern rifle fire and adapted their tactics around it. See, the human dimension. Regular infantrymen of the 24th Regiment of Foot, many barely out of their teens, carried 70 rounds of Martini-Henry ammunition apiece into camp at Isandlwana on the 22nd of January. Colonial volunteers and native levies stood alongside them. Quartermasters, trained under peacetime procedure, controlled ammunition distribution from regimental reserve boxes, a detail that would matter more than anyone yet understood. The stakes sentence. If ammunition resupply broke down under pressure, if a soldier's box ran empty, while Zulu regiments closed the final 100 yards at a dead run, a single-shot rifle with an empty chamber was a 6-foot iron bar with a bayonet and nothing else. At Isandlwana, on that same day, it broke down. The camp fell. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops were killed in a matter of hours, one of the most severe defeats inflicted on a modern colonial army by an indigenous force anywhere in the 19th century. Hours later, at Rorke's Drift, 11 miles away, the story inverted completely. A garrison of barely 150 men, many wounded, some convalescent, none expecting battle, fortified a mission station with mealie-bag walls and biscuit-box barricades. Through the night of the 22nd into the 23rd of January, they held against repeated assaults by 3,000 to 4,000 Zulu warriors, firing volley after volley of Martini-Henry rounds at close range, in a defense later described in official dispatches as without precedent for its scale against such odds. Deployment named precisely. B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot defended Rorke's Drift through 11 hours of continuous assault, their rifles firing so continuously that barrels reportedly required cooling and men reportedly burned their hands changing grip on overheated foreends, a detail recorded in multiple survivor accounts, though exact figures on rounds expended vary between sources. F. Recognition. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense of Rorke's Drift, still to this day the most awarded for a single action in the history of the British Army. Lieutenants Chard and Bromhead were both decorated, so were several private soldiers, an almost unheard of proportion for the era. Innovation at this peak was less about new models than refinement under fire. The Mark II pattern, introduced from 1877, addressed extraction problems reported in earlier actions, where spent brass cartridge cases occasionally failed to eject cleanly from the fouled chamber after sustained rapid fire, a mechanical flaw that field reports from the Zulu War itself helped bring to official attention. There was no single founder alive to inherit this peak. Martini in Switzerland continued his engineering career largely apart from the rifle bearing his name. Henry, in Edinburgh, continued as a gunmaker of individual repute. The institution that inherited the moment was the War Office itself, an anonymous committee whose composite design had just been proven at brutal cost in the harshest test any rifle could face. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic failure. It arrived as a laboratory result. In 1884, French chemist Paul Vieille perfected a stable, smokeless propellant, cordite's continental predecessor, that burned cleaner, produced far less fouling, and generated significantly higher pressures than the black powder every Martini Henry cartridge relied upon. Black powder itself, a coarse-grained explosive mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that produced dense white smoke and heavy barrel fouling with every shot, had defined every rifle Britain had issued for 3 centuries. Its replacement was not a rival company's patent. It was a change in the chemistry of ignition itself, and no falling block single-shot action, however refined, could be adapted to exploit it. Under pressure, the War Office did what institutions under pressure typically do. It hedged before it committed. Trials continued through the mid-1880s, comparing improved single-shot designs against emerging bolt-action, repeating rifles already adopted or trialed by rival powers, the French Lebel, the German Mauser pattern, both capable of storing multiple cartridges in an internal magazine and cycling them without breaking the firing sequence to reload 1 round at a time. No major investment went into a next-generation single-shot Martini pattern. No civilian marketing effort existed to soften a purely military transition. There was nothing to soften. The rifle had never been sold as a civilian product in the first place. The structural threat, when it arrived, was singular and total. The adoption of the Lee Metford in 1888, a bolt-action rifle firing smokeless adjacent ammunition from an 8-round box magazine. A self-contained steel container holding multiple cartridges in sequence, feeding them upward into the chamber as the bolt cycled, eliminating the need to reload after every shot. Where the Martini Henry offered 10 rounds a minute from a single chamber reloaded by hand, the Lee Metford offered sustained magazine fire at a rate no falling block action could approach. There was no bankruptcy filing, no acquiring private equity firm, no debt figure to report. The institutional moat that had protected the Martini Henry for 17 years simply became the mechanism of its own obsolescence. The same War Office that had chosen it now chose its replacement with the same total authority. Workforce and factory did not close. RSAF Enfield retooled rather than shuttered, its machinists and its precision boring expertise redirected toward the new bolt-action pattern rather than discarded. What ended was not a building. It was a design philosophy, single shot, black powder, falling block, retired not gradually across a market, but by administrative order, across an empire, within a matter of years. The rifles themselves did not vanish overnight. Reserve stocks, colonial garrisons, second-line units, then The Boer War arrived in 1899. Some colonial and irregular units still carried Martini Henry Patton rifles into that conflict. Against Boer marksmen armed with German Mauser bolt actions, the gap was no longer theoretical. It was measured in casualties. The frontier rifle of Rorke's Drift had become the rifle nobody wanted to be issued. There was no corporate rebirth to describe, because there had been no company to resurrect. The Martini Henry did not get acquired by a holding firm or relaunched under new ownership. It simply receded from active service, pattern by pattern, as newer bolt-action rifles filled every armory the falling block design had once occupied, though the action itself found a strange second life. Sporting and target versions, chambered in smaller calibers, remained in production and civilian use in parts of the former empire, most notably the northwest frontier and tribal gunsmithing traditions of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. For generations after the British Army retired it, hand-built copies emerging from village workshops long after Enfield's own production line had moved to other patterns. The collector market today values the Martini Henry precisely because so many survive in recognizable, dateable condition. Royal Armouries in Leeds holds documented trial and service examples. The National Army Museum in Chelsea preserves rifles with direct provenance to the Zulu War. Auction houses handling British military antiques, Rock Island Auction Company among them for American buyers, alongside specialist UK arms auctioneers, regularly list Enfield, BSA, and LSA marked examples, with rifles bearing verified Rorke's Drift or Isandlwana provenance, commanding prices far beyond an ordinary service Martini Henry, when such provenance can be documented at all. Why does the original still matter in a functional sense when no one fires a Martini Henry in earnest anymore? Because the falling block action itself, simple, robust, nearly impossible to jam under field conditions compared to more delicate bolt mechanisms, remains a design study for engineering students and gunsmiths examining 19th century mechanical problem solving, a solution built for reliability. First, rate of fire. Second, in an era before anyone had proven which one mattered more. RAF Enfield itself, the site where the rifle was mass-produced, continued manufacturing British service rifles for another century before closing in the late 20th century. Its story, and that of its most famous later product, already told in this series. The surprise footnote belongs to Alexander Henry. Long after the rifle bearing his name had left British service, his rifling system, the 7-groove polygonal profile developed for competition target shooting in the 1860s, continued to influence civilian and target rifle barrel making in Scotland for decades. A quiet, technical inheritance that outlasted the military contract that made his name famous, credited by barrel makers who never fired a Martini Henry in their lives. What the Martini Henry represents, finally, is not a company's rise and fall. It never was a company at all. It represents a specific moment when the British Empire's military logistics, rather than any single inventor's ambition, became the deciding force in a weapon's design, adoption, and retirement. It shows what happens when an institution, not a patent, is the moat, durable while the institution commits to it, and utterly indefensible the moment that same institution changes its mind. The rifle that held Rorke's Drift and lost Isandlwana on the same day was never in control of its own fate. It answered to an empire, and an empire eventually moved on. In museum cases from Leeds to Pretoria, examples still stand with their falling block actions closed, their Enfield proof marks visible on browned steel, exactly as they left the arsenal that built them, silent now, but built for single motion, lever down, lever up, fire. That once, on a January night in 1879, was the only thing standing between 150 men and an army that outnumbered them 20-1. The rifle that replaced it is already part of this story. See you in the next one.